quick tech check with Andrea. Did these show up?
They sure do. They show up on my side.
Awesome. Yay. Okay. Now things are flowing. So I just want to say thanks everybody for joining. I hope that, actually I imagine that a lot of my friends are out there. So hi everybody. And I hope that a whole bunch of new people are here too. And I'm going to dive right into it. Empathy for engineers. And what we want to do is give you a technical approach for understanding other people. And I'm going to divide it up into kind of an oddly organized, starting with what, when, how, why, and who, instead of who, what, when, where, and how. So to begin with, what I want to do is tell you about the different kinds of empathy. So we're going to start with what. And the very first thing to bear in mind is that empathy is not about solving problems. So it's not about oh, I understand your situation and now I can fix it. It's simply giving people a chance to describe what's going on with their reasoning a little bit better and a little bit deeper. Okay, so to actually develop empathy, you need the underlying reasoning. You need to get deeper than things like preferences and opinions, or deeper than explanations. And deeper than explanations might come as a surprise to you. So I'm going to explain that a little bit here. Let me start out by defining empathy. There are some pretty confusing definitions out there. If you read some of the business magazines like Harvard Business Review, they're defining empathy as emotional intelligence. In another article, it defines empathy as being truly responsive to the needs of your customers and your employees. Forbes article, these are all business articles, true, but they're the ones who are trying to say, oh, empathy is a powerful tool. This article says, oh, it's how you connect with and relate to others. And back to Harvard Business Review, oh, it's all about good intentions and better selves. And it just seems like they're all talking about being more sensitive. Like, oh, you need to be a little bit more sensitive. You know, you're not good enough. And so the question then in everybody's mind is, well, like, how does this really apply? How do I apply sensitivity in the work that I'm doing? And the answer is that sensitivity is not empathy. The definitions in those articles are kind of off the mark, very confusing. So let me set the record straight. There are many types of empathy, and I'm only going to talk about the first one and the last two. But there are, I don't know, I got a lot of these from the research I did in psychology. And there are a lot of papers out there defining different kinds of empathy. People are maybe discovering different ways that it plays a part in our cognition. What I want to do is talk about the ways that we can use a couple of these things in our work. So emotional contagion, let's look at that first. So have you ever watched a movie and actually cried? Hopefully you've had that experience. If not, how about, have you ever tried to set the mood for a party, or set the mood for while you're working? Maybe you have a set of tunes that helps you concentrate. What you're doing when you're doing the mood for other people, or when you're directing a movie or writing a screenplay, what you're doing is trying to induce an emotion in someone else. So that's what emotional contagion is. You're trying to make someone else feel something. And in your work, you can use emotional contagion to do some things like give somebody a feeling of trust, make somebody feel safe, make somebody feel valued. Or in the darker patterns, you can make somebody feel like sort of the imperative to buy something, or the imperative to keep scrolling. So there's darker sides to this. I like to try to stay on the bright side of it, but it's good to be aware of the darker sides. I want to talk about the second to last one, which is affective empathy, which is also called emotional empathy in normal language as opposed to psychology language.
Hey, Indi, we lost your slides.
Oh, you did?
Mm-hmm.
Oh dear.
Yep, we see your screen There you go. Now it's back.
Okay, good. Okay, don't know what that was because I'm all wired.
I don't know if you clicked off or something or have a second monitor,
Nope.
but yep.
Yeah, no, I didn't. Everything was good. So just a glitch in the bytes. So anyway, affective or emotional empathy is all about knowing what another person is feeling and being in that feeling for them. So if you've ever seen that movie, it's by Pixar called Inside Out, there is a scene in there where there's 3 characters on a quest. And by the way, if you haven't seen that movie, it's all about the inside of an 11-year-old's brain. And each of her emotions is personified by a character. Here we've got in the yellow dress joy, and with the blue face sadness, and then they're interacting with the character that's there, a pink elephant. And the pink elephant, they're on a quest. They're in a they have to get something done by a certain amount of time, so they're in a hurry. And the pink elephant suddenly loses something that was super important to him. And he stops, and Joy tries to tickle him. Come on, come on, come on, we gotta get going. Come on, be happy, laugh, I gotta get you going. And Sadness, instead, she sits down next to the pink elephant, and she says, you know, that thing that you lost was really valuable for you. You must have had a lot of memories. And the pink elephant starts to tell her about a few of the memories and actually cries a little bit. But 42 seconds later, he stands up and he's ready to go. He says, yep, let's do this thing. That's what emotional empathy is. Sadness has helped the pink elephant through the emotion that he is feeling, that sense of grief and loss. She's helped him through it, and he got out the other side by having a chance to talk about it and have someone understand what that emotion is. So how does that work at the office with your teammates, with your stakeholders? Okay, the way it works is helping someone through an emotional process. For example, if you are listening to someone, try to build rapport with them. Use emotional empathy to build rapport. What's rapport? Rapport is the ability to communicate well because there's a mutual sense of understanding, or because a person feels like they can trust you enough that they think you understand what they're saying and aren't going to attack them. They trust you enough to then tell you some deeper things. Okay, so I will give you some examples of that later. This is the what. Cognitive empathy, that's the other kind of empathy I want to talk about. Cognitive empathy is actually, with a purpose, trying to cultivate an understanding of other people's perspectives. So when you're developing cognitive empathy, you're developing an understanding of the inner voice of another person, sort of, you know, that little chatter box that goes on as you're trying to get stuff done or fulfill a certain intent or purpose. I use those words intent or purpose very carefully, and I will explain that in a minute. But in your work, cognitive empathy is how you help another person. It's how you help another stakeholder. It's how you work with. It's how you communicate with another stakeholder or your peer. It's how you help the end user by understanding what their inner voice is saying, by understanding how they're making their decisions. If you can get down to that level, you then can move on to walk in their shoes and then move on to solutions. But when you're developing empathy, you're simply trying to listen and understand. So one more quick thing. When you hear the word empathy, you often think, okay, I'm going to walk in somebody's shoes. And a lot of the time people are like, yeah, you know, I could walk in, you know, my au pair's shoes, you know. She must have a headache by the end of the day dealing with my kids, right? Because sometimes I get a headache. But you're inventing what's going through her head. You don't know what's going through her head actually until you spend some time developing empathy. So there's a big difference between applying empathy and developing empathy. And I find that a lot of people try to apply it without developing it first. Developing it is the listening. That's the seeking to understand a person before you try walking in their shoes. Maybe the au pair never has a headache because she absolutely adores your kids and can't we wait to get back to them the next day. So don't invent what you think another person is feeling or thinking, okay? So that's what. Now let's talk about when. When, in the case of our work, can kind of be divided into two parts, person to person and engineer to end users. So with the person to person, we, Andrea and I kind of laid it out into 4 different categories. Your stakeholders, your peers, the user, and even yourself. The example, Andrea, do you want to talk about the example that we put there?
Yeah. So I often think about, it's pretty common for me to work on a project, like maybe, you're putting together, let's just use the example of, you need a Ruby gem that does something. And so you toss it together pretty quickly for a project. And then 6 months, a year goes by, and then you need to use it again. Well, if you don't take the time to sit and think about what is myself in 6 months or a year after I don't have the context of this project anymore, going to need in terms of documentation to get kind of everything up and deployed, it's taking that time to think of yourself as the user. And I think this is particularly useful in the context of open source projects, because I see a lot of times where people will get something started and then, there's nothing documented. So sometimes it's hard to think of maybe other users, but it's easier to maybe think of yourself and say, okay, what am I going to need, so that recognizing when I come back to this, I'll be able to get up and running again. So that could be, kind of getting the environment set up. It could be documenting the deployment process. It could be a number of different things. But, and this is also kind of where test-driven development comes in too, where, you're using tests as a way to just ensure that you're continuing your work and that you can have context. So there's a lot of different kind of ways to keep in touch with that.
Awesome. Sweet. So the slide that I've got up here right now is talking about when you might use empathy, not peer-to-peer, but as an engineer to the end user. You might be working in an organization that actually has a design department, a UX department, a research department, and they take care of this kind of thing. But you might be working in an organization, or you might be working on your own, where you don't have those kinds of resources. So this is just a little glimpse into some of the things that developing empathy with your end user can help you do. It can help you get a much broader sense of what that person is going through, so that you might be able to support things that you didn't think of originally. It gives you an ability to do perspective taking. You can step into other people's shoes, understand also different thinking styles that you hadn't thought of in the beginning. Oftentimes I've run across groups that want to develop some sort of an application, and they think that everybody is their user. And it's very important to understand that there are different kinds of thinking styles, and it's best to choose 1 or 2 of those thinking styles and really dial it in for them before you try to make it something that's useful for everyone. You also will have better awareness of your assumptions, ability to kind of approach things from a different direction, and sort of think around or in different pathways than a lot of other people are doing, so that you can come up with something that's truly more supportive of people. And I think that I'm going to mention the dark patterns again. I think that it's really important to be aware of what the ethics and what the consequences are of the things that you're creating. What are the ways that it can play out? And having an understanding of the way end users think can really help with that. So let me explain a little bit about the thing that I mentioned I would explain, those words, purpose and intent. So we get so caught up in the details. I'm definitely a trees for the forest person. Andrea was saying, oh, maybe it's twigs for the forest.
Yeah, my business partner and I say that I'm a continent person, not a forest person, because I naturally see such a big picture. And Scott is a twig person because he immediately sees like the tiniest detail. So there's quite a bit on there.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, details definitely is where I kind of focus too. And you can get kind of caught up in the whole tasks and goals thing. You know, what does this user need? What is this user doing with my tool? What is this user doing, kind of as a result of this tool? What are they running into with this tool? And we kind of forget what their overall purpose or intent is. So let me give you some examples of tasks, goals, and purpose and intent. So when I was doing, I do research, and one of the studies was about, or for a client who makes washers and dryers. But they could be exploring how people sort things into different piles, or they could be exploring sort of that end goal of doing the laundry. But what I wanted to explore was how people take care of their clothes. So how am I taking care of my clothes, which may not involve the washer dryer at all. And actually, in the research I did, it began in the store, people looking at labels, trying to figure out if they wanted to take care of this particular thing. So that gives you a much broader sense of what is going through people's minds. Here's another example. This is for an insurance company that was interested.
Your, screen again.
And I didn't do anything different. My apologies. I wonder if something's happening with the internet providers
sure.
around this area. I think if you
press play, we can see the PowerPoint on your slide, but we lost the large full screen.
That's weird because it's full screen.
There we go. Got it back.
Okay. Don't know. Yeah, it didn't change at all. Weird. Okay. Apologies. Anyway, so this one is for an insurance company. They want, maybe to make the claims process easier for people, understand how people gather the information that they need for a claim, maybe support the goal of making a claim for an accident. But when you look at the larger purpose, people are talking about recovering from an accident, or trying to make sure it doesn't happen again. So here's some of the research I did in this particular case. And we're talking about things like I'm getting safe again. I'm finding out if anyone was hurt. I'm feeling relieved that it's over, and angry at the other person and upset with myself. And it actually goes on to say, I want to try to prevent this from happening again, or to others, both to myself and for others. So convince someone in charge to do something to prevent this from happening again, or change my own actions so this doesn't happen again, or change my habits, improve my safety habits. This gives you a whole new area where you could actually provide support beyond just a form that helps people file a claim. This is in support of that larger purpose, which is recover from an accident. And all that we've got right now is this thing that we get to fill out and maybe talk to a person. So I've talked about what and when. I want to get into how, and I don't on my panel see any Q&A. Andrea, do you want to interject anything right now? Or
I don't see any Q&As either. So if you guys wanted to, you can use the little Q&A button down at the bottom, and we'll make sure that we try to get to those questions at the end. So, I think the biggest thing is that there are so many teams that I know of where they don't have the luxury of having a user experience team or a researcher who will dive in and do this. I wanted to have that job for the longest time and realized that it was really difficult to get several years ago. And so as you're developing, this is a really good practice to dive in. And I think if you don't have that information, the how, like if you're developing and you're like, oh, well, maybe it could be a different way. I think these next couple of sections are going to really dive into the details of how do you collect this, and then how do you develop that deep listening. And the biggest piece I think that's the takeaway from what you just heard is that it's 2 steps. It's developing by listening, and then it's applied by perspective taking. And a lot of times that's a very internal kind of thought, especially if you're a software engineer or if even you're a civil engineer. It's thinking about the problem. So I'll let Indi continue with the details of how we actually develop cognitive empathy for our users.
Great. And I see that we got just one question in, which I'm going to address right now before we go into how, because I think what I say in answer to that is going to lead into how. So the question is, on a team where trust is low, how can you develop trust? How can you sort of change that feeling that the team has? And one of the ways is to listen. The most amazing thing that could happen to a person is to have someone listen to them. It is actually a very empowering feeling. There is a danger the listener may end up having to sit there and listen for an hour while somebody goes on and on. But if you have some skill, which I'm going to teach you kind of the basics of, and we can do a more advanced course later, if you have that skill, you can actually help that person talk about the inner reasoning as opposed to just complaining for an hour. And then it isn't some situation where you're forced to endure, but instead what you're doing is you're building rapport and you're building trust between the two of you. It probably will take a while. I say that it's definitely more difficult in situations where you have history or baggage with people, and you have to sort of overcome that and say, okay, listen, we're trying something new. I'm going to listen to you. We're going to have a listening session, and then maybe tomorrow we'll have a listening session where you listen to me. You can also do sort of a reflective practice.
Yeah, I was going to add on to that, Indi. So, one of the best ways that I've seen, at least in the software world, is through the agile practice of doing a retrospective. And it's really short. It's 3 questions. It's what went well, what could be better, and what should change. But the most important part, rather than just the 3 questions, is the prime directive of the retrospective, which acknowledges that no matter what happened, everyone did their best given the information and the resources that they had at the time. And what that does is it takes shame and blame away from the conversation. Because it's so easy to go, well, so-and-so didn't do their job and this and this and that. And that's actually not very productive. And so by using the tool of empathy in a very structured way through a retrospective, and you can do a retrospective in a context of a problem, right? So you can do it, we do it every week on our team, but then we also do it every week for each client. You can do it in a specific context for, this project went really weird, what happened? So again, what went well, what could be better, what should change? And then the prime directive is no matter what happened, everyone did their best given the information and resources they had at the time. So that's been a really good trust building exercise that we've used.
Interesting. Yeah, that's the first I've heard of a retrospective. So that sounds really good. I love the prime directive. The idea of looking at another person in a positive light as opposed to looking at another person in a negative light is very important. I don't really like the 3 questions. They tend to take you down the rat hole of complaining and blaming and shaming, like you said, but maybe just try the prime directive.
Yeah. And that's why it's so important every time, because it's, what went well, right? It's like, okay, these things happen, but then also to acknowledge what should be better, like what could be better. And then the last one is what should change. And sometimes it could be, nothing. Right now we are in a holding pattern. We're constrained by our resources. Even though there are things that could have been better, but it's acknowledging everything, I think, with a very, honest perspective. And I think it's that honesty and openness that allows everybody to kind of get past the shame and blame. And it happens not just once, it happens when you hold these over and over and over again. And
you develop a practice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's talk about how. So I want to introduce the idea of active listening. Some of you have probably heard of this. And active listening is very different than your regular kind of listening. It's following what a person is saying. Kind of like this analogy that I use here of going on a tour in a foreign city that you're visiting. Let's say you follow the tour guide around, the tour guide's talking about what happened here historically. Even though you've got a burning desire to talk about the architecture of the church down the street, you know that the guide hasn't brought it up yet, has never mentioned churches or architecture. The tour is really about the personal history. So you don't interrupt. You don't change the subject. You listen, you follow. And following is very important in listening because it gives the other person the sense that you want to hear what they have to say, as opposed to the regular sense that you're waiting for them to pause so it can interject what your thought is. So it's very different than a regular conversation. It's actually following what somebody's saying and not thinking about what you want to interject, but picking up on what they say and maybe asking more about what they say. Your questions, your interjections can only be about the things that have. So let me talk a little bit about being able to sense what's going on in a conversation. I said earlier that opinions and preferences and explanations and also statements of fact, those don't allow you to develop empathy, to develop cognitive empathy. They might give you a sense of emotional empathy, depending on the tone in which they're delivered, but they don't allow you to develop cognitive empathy. To really understand the inner voice, the inner thinking of someone, you need to get them to talk to you about what their reasoning is, what actually went through their head during, that week where they were trying to develop that particular thing. This might happen during the retrospective. Instead of just talking about, I did this and here's how it happened and I really didn't like it, which are all up at the upper surface level, you can find out what went through their head. Listen, I was trying to do this, but I kept running into this bug and I kept trying to contact that person about it. But that connection never happened. And so I tried to work around and I was looking up this and that. And then I ran into this deadline. And so I just threw a patch in there and hoped for the best. And I really did try to follow up with that person, but never got through to them. Found out later that they were actually on vacation, that kind of thing. Oh, wow. So there was a lot of reasoning going on and I can't blame you because it didn't happen. The other things that happen at the depth are getting a sense of what their reactions were. So you can hear in that example I just gave the sense of stress that I'm unable to get a hold of this person and I'm having to put a patch in because of this deadline. This makes me feel very uncomfortable. You can ask people about that as well. May not make sense in a retrospective, but it's good to be aware of. To be able to identify as you're hearing people saying things, whether they're speaking up at the surface or whether they're speaking more at the depth. And if they are only at the surface, try to convince them, ask them questions about these depth things so you can get them to talk about them. One last thing there in that list is guiding principles. That's kind of your operating instructions that you sort of started out with as a kid. And you developed over time. It's like, always make sure that other people know where I'm going to be, that kind of a thing. They can develop into very specific applied situations, but that's what a guiding principle is. I think for your purposes right now, reasoning is the most important thing to look for, trying to get below the surface. And maybe an awareness of what those reactions are that are happening, that are sort of being telegraphed by what that person is saying. So this slide, the telepathy server is down. It actually hasn't been running yet. If the telepathy server were to run at some point in the future, then we truly wouldn't have to talk to one another. it would be great. We could just hear what each other are thinking and sort of communicate that way. Woohoo! Unfortunately, we can't do that, and it requires that we talk to one another. And I know that most of the time, your communication is asynchronous. My communication is asynchronous, except when I'm doing a tech check with Andrea. But it's really important that at those moments, when you notice that the understanding doesn't seem to be forming, when you notice that you've had to repeat yourself and the other person isn't quite getting what you were saying, that's when you need to, do a Slack call or do a screen share with people super quick. But that's the indicator. Don't let those red flags come up and ignore them. If you ignore them, then that leads to nasty tangled webs of things and distrust among team members. So it's important to actually make that effort to reach out to somebody when you see that understanding is not forming. Don't have to do it all the time, but you're going to see these little red flags come up, and it's important to develop or mature your awareness of when these things are coming up. Maybe be able to think of an example in your own work just last week where understanding was not forming. We're going in a circle, right? So let me give you some steps to follow for active listening. The first step is the active listening step of listening. How odd, right? But I have to write it down because it's important to remind you that we're not thinking our own thoughts so we can interject our own ideas about what's being said. We're not thinking our own thoughts. We're trying to turn that machine off just for the time that we're interacting with somebody, then when we're on the Slack call or whatever, so that we can hear them, so that we can give them a chance to explain themselves and gives ourselves a chance to ask questions to get down below the surface to the depth. You can also show the other person that you listened by reflecting back what you heard. This is a very important thing when you are at odds, when you're not happy with one another and you disagree. It's very important to take that step to reflect back. You don't always have to reflect back, but what I mean by it is, somebody saying, I really wish that I wasn't the one who was always responsible for this. It always seems like I, have to take care of the problems and stay at work late on a Friday when you guys all take off. That makes, makes me pissed, right? So you reflect back. So I hear that you're feeling very upset that we seem to abandon you most Friday evenings, and you're sort of the one who's everybody assumes is responsible for wrapping stuff up for the team. You can't say, oh, but it's not every Friday evening. It's only like one Friday evening a month. You can't say that. Reflecting back is what the other person said. And by saying it, that other person says, oh, okay, you're understanding me. Or that other person's all like, oh, maybe I'm saying that too harshly. Maybe I need to say it in a different way. And so they can say it again and you can reflect back again. But this process of reflecting back when you are at odds is very helpful for developing trust between people. You can actually get to agreement too if you do the reflecting carefully enough. Another step in this, and these are not linear steps, these are different things you can do in active listening. Like I said, show that you listen by reflecting is when you are at odds. Notice your assumptions and actually state them. This is a really powerful thing for not only yourself, but for the entire team. If you guys get in a habit of being more mature about noticing assumptions and actually being brave enough to say, oh, I had assumed you meant blah, 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 or I had assumed that when you created that little function there, you intended it to be used in this particular way. And the other person's all like, oh, of course, you just assumed, no, I meant this, it's okay. And you're not so mad at each other anymore. You don't think the other person's an idiot. if you get into this kind of a habit, it's a very helpful thing for teamwork, for team building. It's also a super helpful thing internally for your own cognition, because a lot of the time we ignore that we haven't verified what we assume is going on around us. And that's a very good habit to get into, not only in your work, but also in your personal life and, the news media, all these other kinds of areas, right? Another thing that you can do in active listening is ask a person about a simple concept. This may sound ludicrous, but I do this a lot because what I want to do is come at it with a beginner's mind. My understanding of what they're talking about could be very different than their understanding of what they're trying to say. So there might be some sort of a simple thing. Andrea, can you think of a quick example? I'm putting you on the spot here.
I had the wrong mute button. Yeah. Okay. So Scott and I run into this a lot, being so different. So there's an example that's not in our work context.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we're getting ready to move, and I'm going to be out of town during our move because I've got a speaking engagement. And so I told Scott, oh, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take an inventory of all of our stuff and I'll put it into an Excel spreadsheet, and I'll basically just kind of create a little bit of a database, and all of the numbers will be itemed. And then that way we can, kind of mark, and I'll put stickers on the sofa, and then I'll create a map for kind of where things should go. So that hopefully will make the move day really easy. And Scott got really stressed about this, and we were trying to figure out where the disconnect was. Well, because I'm a very big continent person and Scott is a detailed person, when he saw my inventory, he's like, Andrea, you only have 73 things on this list. Like, we own a lot more stuff than that. I was like, no, that's about accurate. He goes, oh, I thought you were going to put a sticker on every individual Q-tip that we own because you used the word everything. And so that was an assumption there. And I did say the word everything, right? But I was thinking in more broad categories. So, these are things that even when you build a good rapport with somebody, you can still run into this. That's kind of a fresh example of what I'm thinking of today. But that runs into things a lot. And it is this, the precision of language helps, but then also just making sure that, if there is an assumption, like, does that mean that you're going to label every Q-tip? Oh, no, just kind of broad categories, right? Yeah. So, and that could have avoided some of that.
Yeah, definitely. So we've got a couple of questions about, like, how do you do this? How do you do this without it feeling really awkward? And so, like, in your particular example, if I were Scott, I would have said, and by everything you mean, that kind of thing. So I'm constantly doing this, even with my own partner. But with people that I work with, I'll say this, and by, categories, you mean, I know what a category is, and I have an assumption about what it is, but I say, by categories, you mean, and I'll just do this, and it's lightweight, and it can become very quick. I mean, such and such. When Scott might have said, by everything you mean, you're like, oh, couches and bookshelves, that kind of thing. And he's like, oh, okay. All right, quick, done, right? So fun habits. What I do with that little rule is you just pick out the word that's the simple concept, or the word that you could possibly have an assumption about, and you just say, by whatever that word is, you mean ? The same token for reflecting. The question is, how do we sort of start doing that without making people feel like children? Well, I heard you say. So there's a lot of phrases that you can use. You can say things like, well, just to make sure I understand, you mean blah, blah, blah. But what I like to say also is, well, I heard you say da, 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 am I right? Or, so you're saying blah, blah, blah. And by you're not saying their exact words back. You're semi-interpreting them, and you're also using some of their words. But by doing that semi-interpretation and by phrasing it, so what you're saying is blah, 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 you're giving them a chance to hear what your understanding is of that person, or is of what they're saying. Yeah.
I think the question was a little bit more about how do you get other people to do that habit? How do you get without them feeling like a child? And you know what I do is I monitor my own behavior and hope to lead by example.
Yep.
And I make it clear that if I think it's hard to do in a peer-to-peer relationship, but if you are leading a team, you can set the expectation, but I think it is very difficult to kind of show someone else or demand.
Actually, I would disagree.
Yeah, okay.
I think there's ways.
To learn your tips. That's me.
There are ways. Exactly. So to try to train other people, yes, by example, definitely. But also when another person does an interjection or does sort of like, no, what you blah, 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 you're like, okay, wait, what do you think I said? Okay, so just asking, what do you think I said, is a way to start that circle. And that is that can be said in a very stringent sort of tone of voice, which you don't want to take. It's like, well, what do you think I said? Or some, related phrasing to that.
Yeah. I'll often preface things like that with, I'm curious. Like, so then that way it's more of an inquisitive.
Yeah. You could even say, well, it sounds like you think I said X. Is that what you think? Yeah. And let them answer before you say, sounds like you think I think X, but I said Y. Let it slow down a little bit. Let the trust build. I know everybody's in a big hurry, but if we want this empathy to actually be helpful to us and helpful to our teams, and if we want communication to work better, a little bit more slowness is going to give us a lot more speed later.
Yeah. And in the phrase, is this Bob Martin, I think, but the best way to go fast is to go well. I think Uncle Bob said that. And I think it goes with conversation too. I'll just finish answering. There was one more question about phrasing that I'll go ahead and take up is one of the things to do with teams to make sure nobody says what is working, what is not working, because saying what needs improvement means we can make things better. But when we say what is not working, the hope of fixing is gone, and because it isn't working. Do you have any suggestions on how to pose these questions? And I'll just give you my experience of a writing group that I'm in. It's the Theano, Theano writing group, and it's run by a wonderful woman named Catherine. And she sets it up so that when we review people's pieces, the way that we do it is the first is just, what was this piece about? Right. So again, it's a framework, right? So it's just kind of a non-judgmental, this is what it is. But then the last two questions are, what makes this piece strong? And then the last is, instead of what's broken, it's what would make this piece even stronger? So demonstrating that it is already strong, but that there are ways that you can improve. And I tell you, as a writer, like I love the feedback that I get. And because it's phrased as, no, you've already done a good job, this is a way to make it even better, it imbues the sense of optimism into the feedback, and it makes me really grateful. So that's something that I've used that I really like. So Catherine Britton, she's the one who runs the group. And I think
what makes this strong and what would make it stronger. I love that. Nice. Okay, cool. Well, I've got a bunch more things to get through, so I'm going to speed ahead. There are some other things about how to develop empathy that you want to bear in mind. One is that you are not the expert of how another person is thinking. You need to let them have a chance to illuminate you. A lot of the time people will forget this. And you probably all have someone on your team who forgets this all the time. But the rest of you can probably practice and mature yourselves. And maybe by being around you, that other person will catch on, hopefully. Also, when you are interacting with people, very often you will judge or feel contempt for them. And one of the little phrases that I like to have ringing in my head when I feel a judgment coming on is her pain is real, or his pain is real. They're experiencing something that I'm not experiencing, but it doesn't mean that it's not valid. Okay. So to bear that in mind, also with this scary looking rat's photo, you're gonna have emotional reactions. You can't stop them. They're like weather. You can't make the weather go away, but you can sort of prepare yourself to deal with the weather. In this case, you want to be aware. Be aware of when you're having an emotional reaction. Give yourself permission to examine what that reaction is briefly, and sort of say, oh, look, it's anger, or I'm pissed at this person. But don't dwell on it. Just say, oh, yeah, okay, there it is. Now I want to get back to listening. Now I want to hear more of what they're saying, because maybe now that they've made me pissed, they're about to explain their inner reasoning, and I need to catch this rather than just staying pissed and sort of spiraling around in my own reaction. So this is just a sense of what it looks like when you can mature your understanding and your awareness of the internal workings of your mind. So we've only got about 12 minutes left, and what we were going to do was go through some examples here, but I have a bunch of other slides I want to get through. So Andrea, can we pop through these fairly quickly, like within 3 minutes?
Sure. Yeah. And I think, we may have touched on a couple of these earlier, but the idea is that recognizing that when you're giving input, let's say to a product manager, ultimately the product roadmap that you're developing is a tool for communicating your ideas to the stakeholders. And so using that as a tool, both for listening and then also for providing feedback. Same thing with your teammates. So we see this a lot on code reviews where, I know Scott and I recently gave a talk where he talked about how he used to get told all the time that he was really mean on his code reviews. And a lot of times it was because he didn't display any empathy. It was, this should be a method, right? And it was very just kind of matter of fact. And in reality, and he was like, no, that was just my opinion. And he didn't think about sometimes how that would be read or how it might, feel for the other person who's reading it. And so now he makes a very conscious attempt. And so we gave an example of, now he'll say something like, whenever I see, a line of code like this, I always wonder, should it be a method? And that small change in language from inviting a dialogue and inviting someone to basically demonstrate their reasoning, all of the things that Indi was talking about, like basically assuming that there were good reasons, right? And it's like, yeah, I'm planning on doing that in the next cycle. I just wanted to get a prototype and a proof of concept up, to the client quickly, right? That might be very valid, right? But it invites a dialogue for understanding some of those deeper intentions rather than just, you should do this. The user, right? So thinking about somebody who needs a bug fixed, right? How is that bug actually impacting them? What is it that is preventing them from doing? Is it a loss of productivity? And sometimes I like to use the tool of an empathy map to help me just kind of visualize a little bit, where there's an image of a person kind of in the middle, and then you're thinking like, what is that person hearing? What is that person thinking? What is that person saying? What is that person, what does their day-to-day look like? What are they seeing? And that helps you kind of figure out and figure out what is the best fix. Is it just a patch, or do you need to invest in doing a root cause? And I tell you, some of the best ways that I've ever seen getting budget for some refactoring or for, some modernization products is to tie it back to the user. And so if you can document and say, we've talked to users and we've, uncovered these underlying concerns like Indi's saying, and then you put that on the product roadmap as your rationale and as your justification, that is something that is going to really resonate with executives, because I know that's something that everyone cares about, right? We all care about our users. And then I already talked a little bit about the, itself. So, so just remembering like, what is it that I'm going to need to kind of jog my memory, So.
It's kind of the future Andrea, right?
Yeah.
I do that a lot. I'm like, sometimes I go, thank you, past Indi, for something that I did in the past that makes it much easier for me now. Okay, excellent, good. So I want to talk a little bit about these skills. So we sort of talked to you about active listening. We give you a lot of different ways to do it, steps, and also some examples, but how do you actually make this happen? And one of the things that I emphasize is just trying out with baby steps. You need to practice. You kind of can't just jump in with 2 feet and be an expert. And the practice I would like to see happen in all sorts of different ways. But just as an analogy, when you're learning like a game or something, you could definitely learn all the rules. But if you didn't actually play the game, you would not have any experience. And the experience is what's going to make these things a little bit more natural and something that you can call to mind. And the experience is what's going to allow you to mature. So where can you do some of these baby steps? You can definitely do baby steps at work. But I would love, and I encourage everybody to do baby steps every day, at least once a day. Maybe every other day. I can't say that I do it every day. But like when you're in a situation with other people, I call them familiar strangers. They're there with you in line, at the cafeteria, or they're there with you in a tour group, or they're there with you at the finish line of some running race that you're doing. There's people standing around. Instead of you just sort of being quiet or checking your phone, go stand next to somebody, or you might be already next to somebody in the line, and say something about what's happening. Like nice day, or God, I love that bag. Where did you get it? Just something that could be construed as inoffensive enough that the other person might answer you, and you might be able to have a little bit of a conversation back and forth. And as you're having that conversation back and forth, try, instead of having a regular, like, I'm going to interject now and say what ideas came up for me, try to just talk about what they said. Try to do your active listening. Try to follow what they were saying and pick up a topic and ask more about it and see if you can go a little bit deeper. It can be fun. It can also be scary and off-putting when the person's all like, yeah, no, I just got online, and goes back to their phone, right? They don't want to talk to you. Okay, fine. I'll try again later. Your heart might beat a few beats faster. You tried. That's good. Give yourself points for that. Try again later in the day or tomorrow. But it's important to do these little baby steps. That's why I spent so many minutes on that slide. Okay, so now let's talk about why. Empathy helps you communicate your ideas. So Andrea was talking about the stakeholders and the product map.
And heads up, it switched over to not full screen again.
That's interesting. Okay, I'm going to go back.
There you go. Nope, now you're good.
That's weird.
I don't know what it is, but
yeah, it's going to be something on Zoom. Anyway, so empathy helps you communicate your ideas, like I said, with the product map. It helps you by understanding the way that your stakeholder is reasoning. You can then adopt some of the ways that they're thinking to explain where you're going with that thinking. This is important. You can solve problems faster. Andrea, you were talking about less context switching.
Yeah, so that's something that engineers really, really value, is the idea of like needing a lot of time right? Uninterrupted time to just get into a really deep state of flow.
Right. Yes. Okay. So
And
to stay in that, you will be able to stay in that if you've gathered that deeper understanding. If you don't have these sort of, I'm just going to do this based on this assumption.
it switched again, Indi.
Interesting. Okay. Well, what I'm going to do is go to the next slide and go back.
There
How
we
about
go.
that?
Perfect.
Okay. All right. So you can also explain yourself and make more persuasive arguments for getting a better solution in place. And it's a great way for you to figure out just exactly how much needs doing and how much doesn't need doing, especially if you've got a really good understanding of the thinking styles of the end user that you've got. A deeper understanding of that, you can say, well, listen, that's for a different thinking style. Let's not deal with that now. Let's just think about this particular kind of end user. So empathy really does help you make something to support the end user. And real quick, I want to get into this. I've heard so many people say algorithms are neutral. I think there are more people now who are recognizing that they're not neutral, that they are a result of all of the minds that were involved in creating them. And those minds hold a lot of experience, but they don't hold all experience. It's impossible to hold all experience. And what I'm concerned about is making algorithms a little bit more aware of experience. Right now, I think the way that we do this is by exploring edge cases and trying to be very cognizant of all these different edge cases, but we can't capture all of them, and harmful things happen. This happened to Eric Meyer. Some of you probably may have heard of him. This was his daughter who got cancer and died the day before her 6th birthday. It was horrifying. And his year in review showed her picture and all these happy people around it. And that was not a very nice thing to do to Eric. Luckily, he's a very mature guy, and he wrote an article and did a bunch of talks about kind of how the algorithms are just really, they're like 4-year-olds. They don't understand yet. So how do you explore all of the edge cases when you're developing for an end user, when it seems like it's an infinity? There's as many people out there as we can explore. Well, that's kind of impossible. We try to do it by understanding statistics. The statistics are full of assumptions. This is the average passengers and how many of them check bags, and then a breakdown by gender and age. And it's sort of ridiculous because when we did the actual research, it did not break down by any of those demographics, but by thinking style and by context. Like, I'm carrying beer home from Belgium from my business trip, and I want to bring it to people. There's no way I can check it through. So the idea is try to understand people's thinking styles and map to those instead. When you are looking at thinking styles, you're looking at thinking styles within a certain scope. You may be working with that one set of thinking styles for 5 years until you get to the point where you can start adding more thinking styles on or exploring more of them. Just wanted to mention there was a good article that talks about how algorithms are not neutral. It's out on the Aspen Institute called To Fix a Broken Internet, Coders Revisit Their Code of Ethics. Also, Christina Engelbart had a good talk about bringing up the idea of simplifying algorithms. She's like, what's the whole big deal about simplifying? What we want to do is really complexify, or rather splinter, make a whole lot of algorithms where those algorithms each have a specialization. Right now, the algorithms don't take any time to listen to their end user. And I think this is actually going to come soon. They're going to start to listen. They're going to start to adjust instead of just taking their inputs. And we'll have some emergent behavior based on this. If we want to support emergent behavior, We need deep understanding. We need to understand what the thinking styles of people are. What is the reasoning? What are the reactions? What are the guiding principles? And how can we recognize them? How can we teach our algorithms to recognize those and perhaps recognize when they can't support them and hand off to a different algorithm that they think may be able to support it? So this is the last slide. Endless diversity, N+1 use cases is going to add to our abilities, add to the abilities of our algorithm. So quickly, who? I'm assuming most of you are dropping off now, so it's a quick answer. It's you. Yes, you do have the skills. Just because people tell you that you're not a people person, or maybe you've told yourself you're not a people person, it doesn't have to be the limit. That doesn't have to be the way that you think of yourself. We're all humans. We all have the skill. There are some people who don't have the skill, but they're fairly well identified by psychologists. You may not have the cognitive ability, but these people are rare. So what I want to do is encourage you to try this out, to try to develop it. It's a possibility. It's an area that you can mature for certain, and it has a lot of value. And as an engineer, even the act of building something for someone else to make their job easier is an act of connecting with that person. So sort of at the root of what we do as engineers is connection, is being able to support people. I'm going to skip this slide. It's just a quote from another engineer who says, I really am curious about how other people think, right? It's like, it's not software, it's bioware, it's wetware, and there are ways that people think, and there are ways for us to understand. So like I mentioned, take a little bit more time, slow things down a little bit more in terms of your understanding of people and the way that you're asking them for a little bit more depth. Slow things down so that you can then come at them rather than with distrust, but with a positive image. Like, yes, they're trying. Yes, they're thinking. There's a lot of action and energy going on behind those eyes, and I want to find out what that is going on behind those eyes. So I want to thank you guys very much for joining us. Andrea and I have a couple of newsletters out there. I have a couple of books. I've got a discount code for you at Rosenfeld Media if you want to pick up one of the books. Practical Empathy is the most recent. And
I highly recommend it. I've read a lot of books on empathy over the years, and Indi's is probably my favorite, especially if you're an engineer, because she wrote it specifically in building software. Her specialty is user experience. And so for me, whenever I use any of her work in my talks, I always explain her work as kind of the technical guide, like the technical manual for how to, use empathy as an engineer. So it's definitely worth picking up. It's a really, really good read. Mine's dog-eared and bookmarked and highlighted all over. So I'm sure yours will be too. This was great. Thank you so much, Indi, and thank you, everyone. If you have any questions, we can stick around for a couple of minutes. I know that most people kind of have their days scheduled, but we have one question left here. Oh, really great presentation.
Not a question. Yay.
Lots of gold in there. Thank you. Awesome. Well, I'm so glad. Thank you, Paul, and thank you, everyone, for listening. And we really appreciate it. And hopefully we've recorded this, so hopefully this can be something that you can refer back to. We'll email everybody with the links. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful day.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.